All right, we're back. And it's time for the next edition of Lighthouse Jock Bible Study. Now, I will remind you that, because this one is going on the Bible channel, unlike the one that we did for episode number 11 last week, or a couple days ago, I guess. But this one is going on the Bible Study channel. So if you are watching on the Lighthouse Jock Bible Study channel and you would like to subscribe to the regular show as well, which, don't get me wrong, if you just want to get into the Bible, right, and if you just want to do the Bible study part of the show, then I totally understand, right? That's, completely understandable. You want to remain wholesome and not get dragged down into the depths of reality with the rest of the show, right? I get it, okay? But if you do want to listen to the full show, then you can subscribe on the main channel over at Lighthouse Jock on YouTube. But again, if you want to just follow the Bible portion of it, then you can stay right here on at Lighthouse Jock Bible Study, which is where these segments, look, I don't cut them out of the main show because that is part of my duty, right? That's part of my kind of outreach program with him. That's part of my missionary work as a good Christian. Not a self-proclaimed good Christian, right? It's completely different. It's all an attempt. It's all an effort. But that's just part of what I got to do, right? Is at least try and expose some of the stuff to the people listening to the main show too. But if you're just on board for the Bible study and don't want to listen to the main show, that's okay. But if you want to, then you can head right on over there too. So today, as I kind of reconnect with him a little bit, because, if you listen to the last show and you listen to the Bible study segment that did not go on the Bible channel, it was kind of where I talked about my recent fall off with him, right? Where I started to disconnect with him a little bit and was basically asking for a path back to him, right? If that makes any sort of sense. And he led me to a passage that I didn't quite know why he led me to, but ended up kind of finding out a little bit later, just based on going through it. Look, here's how it works, right? He points you in a direction, and that direction generally tends to show you the way, right? So one of the things that has been on my mind since starting my journey through Christianity, right, and journey through the path that he sets out in front of me, right, which is a thing that I think potentially stops some people from becoming believers, is this idea of all of the stuff that they hear about in the Old Testament, right? Because in the Old Testament, what was referred to as Yahweh, the God of Israel, right? That is the God that we're talking about here, right? And so one of the things that I think stops some people from becoming full-on believers, right, is this idea that, and this all stems from like a take that I read, because there's a certain group of people that I follow on Twitter that's like this kind of esoteric spirituality group of people, right? And a lot of that stems, like a lot of my interest in that stems from, the days of doing drugs, right? And so that was my foray into that world, right? But there's an interesting part of it. Like, I do think that there's some elements of truth in how that kind of shows you how the mechanics of the world work. And ultimately, what led me to God, right, is this idea that, hey, look, he designed the mechanics of the world like this. He kind of sets things out in motion, and however things may happen after that, he sets the rules, right? And the things that happen, the kind of operating figures that happen within the rules that he creates just kind of happens, but it happens under the rules that he sets for us, right? But going back to that earlier point, which is that one of the things that stops, I feel like, some people from becoming believers and even believing in God is this idea that, and here's a common take that some people may have about Old Testament God, right? So the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament in the Bible is the Old Testament is pre-Jesus, right? And the New Testament is kind of post-Jesus. At least, and that's a very, very simplified way of putting it. But the difference basically is, and how do I put this? I don't want to say what I thought before, right, was that God kind of expected us all to be perfect in a way. But, oh man, I went to church a couple weeks ago, and the message that I got there, like, perfectly put this into words, and I'm trying to find a way to kind of get it back out, right? So it started with Adam, right? Like, in the before times, he made us all in his image to be this image of perfection, right? But then you all know the story of Adam and Eve, right? As soon as the apple gets eaten, right, that kind of that veil of perfection was instantly shattered in that moment. And so then, of course, then Jesus comes along, he dies for all of our sins, right? And infuses the Holy Spirit in each one of us, right? This is why we can kind of hear his voice sometimes. This is why that uncharacteristic voice that pops up in your head occasionally is him, right? So it's the time periods are kind of divided into somewhat Old Testament and New Testament periods where, and I'm not quite entirely sure what the point of that is, right? But again, going back to the original point, circling back, which is, and I know I'm kind of using a roundabout way to get to it, but the thing that stops some people from believing is this idea that Old Testament God is like evil. He's evil, he's wrathful, he's kind of vain. And there was a time where I believed it too, but I just kind of chose to put it on the back burner because I thought, okay, surely he has a reason for this, right? Or, surely there's a deeper meaning behind all of this that we are all missing. Like, certainly there's some context here that we just cannot even fathom, right? And so I read this tweet from one of the spiritual people that I follow, and it's one that I disagree with, so I'm not necessarily going to put this one on the screen, right? And so this one was about sacrifice. This one was kind of a tongue-in-cheek. Jesus was supposed to be the end of all sacrifices. Sacrifice was heavily practiced in pre-Christian times. Fine, cool, I get that. What I don't get is why would an omnipotent God need sacrifice? Well, it wouldn't. A God, on the other hand, perhaps does. So he's trying to kind of imply that, like, why would an all-loving God like require sacrifice to him? And that goes back to a lot of the problems that I and many other people have with the Old Testament, which is, and I talk about this a lot of the times with my stepbrother and his family, right? Where they'll talk about some of the problems that they have with the Old Testament. Like we had a talk one night where they were basically like, okay, so we were going through the Old Testament sometimes and we had to close it and kind of sit with it for a moment and just look up and ask God, like, I don't get it. I don't understand this. I don't understand why you did this. Like, I really don't understand why. And they just kind of acknowledged in that moment that, look, we don't have to have all the answers. But I still, even after that, still kind of had a little bit of an issue with that until I read this post. And we're going to go through some of Exodus a little bit because that, of course, was the story of, of course, the first couple chapters, we're going to start at chapter 3, right? The first couple chapters talk about, Moses being born, right? And so Exodus deals with the it kind of deals with the battle between the God of Israel and the exodus, of course, of the Jews from Israel into their own kind of land. It's probably one of the most important books in the Old Testament because it records God's act of saving the Israelites and establishing them as like a covenant community, kind of, which is like a nation that he chooses to serve him. So like God kind of takes all the Israelites out of Egypt and leads them across the desert. You've heard the story before. This is one of the most well-known stories in the Bible, right? This is the story of Exodus. And that's kind of how it starts, right? And a lot of the catalyst for that, like one of the central figures in this is, of course, Moses. And the first couple chapters just kind of talks about Moses being born, right? But we've heard the common story about Moses at the burning bush, right? Moses at the burning bush, he kind of listens to it and he goes, excuse me, yes, burning bush? Oh, all right, that's God. And then he brings forth, the 10 Commandments, and you know how it goes, right? You know how it goes. Supposedly this happened around the 1400 BC time, right? So this is all like way, way before Jesus. This is when God, which, they call Yahweh, the God of Israel, he's still kind of making himself known in little pieces and pockets throughout the world, only choosing very specific people, Moses being one of them, of course. And first of all, I'm not sure whether or not we should go through the Bible part of it first, or whether or not we should go through the I think we'll go through the Twitter post first, actually. So this comes from a user, and I'm not going to put this on the screen. I'm just going to read it out. This comes from a user named Delusional Path on Twitter as a response to that original post, right? And this perfectly captures into words some of the problems that I have with the Old Testament and puts them into context and makes it make sense. So I'm going to go through some of this, and maybe some other people that also have some problems with the Old Testament can kind of make peace with that and allow yourself to maybe move on from your problems with it and believe anyway, because I was getting to be in that camp, when I talked about my stepbrother's family and some of the conversations that we were having with each other about how they would have to put down the Old Testament after reading it and go, I don't know, man. Surely you must have had a reason for it. And I would have gotten there eventually, I think, but reading this post definitely helps. He says, from what I gather from reading the Bible, the Old Testament is the reality of the symbolic Ouroboros, which is the kind of the circular nature of how reality works, right? Like the Ouroboros is that image of like the snake eating its tail, right? And it just implies everything goes in a nice little circle. In the Old Testament, you see the cycles of the ebb and flow of light and darkness, which is spiritual warfare, and how when the people were willing to make the sacrifices associated with trusting in God, they won the battle, both literally and figuratively. Of course, as living creatures, we would question why the most high principle of goodness, the logos, the word, the vibration of creation itself, why would God ever sacrifice a life instead of considering what life means to a being that is beyond life? Now, he kind of makes some connections afterward. It's like God equals generator, operator, destroyer, right? It has different names in different cultures. Like he talks about how Sikhs and Hindus and New Age spiritualists would all call him different names. Jews would say Yahweh. A sacrifice is the faithfulness in the belief that God is beyond life. And this is key because, a sacrifice, first of all, implies that, not much is beyond our current realm of reality, right? Because if the idea of a sacrifice is being so sacrilegious, right, then first of all, that just kind of implies that, the life that we have here is kind of it, right? And that's a good point. That's not really something that I had considered before, right? Because if we're taking, sacrifice as the end all be all, and this is just one point, by the way, this is a much longer post. If we take a sacrifice as the end all be all, then that just means that, only our lives here on this earth is what matters. That sacrificing makes all of that the most important thing. And it's a very good point that kind of makes you remember, like, wait a minute, if we all have spiritual lives too, and we all have, like he says, faith in the belief that God is beyond life, then what is a sacrifice really all that important for? He continues, it's testimony that God sustains, provides, and brings anew. Most of all, it is the testament of faith. Only through quantum leaps of faith does one become truly great and reap abundant peace and prosperity. Whether that was symbolically by sacrificing part of your herd, part of your crops, tithing to the church, or going all in for what you know to be what is good and right and fruitful by doing everything you know to be honoring to God. Hey, it sounds a little bit like the show. Still, it wasn't knowledge, prophecy, or sacrifice that delivered God's people, those who believe, from suffering. It is always through the faith that is expressed by obedience. We see the clear illustration in the Old Testament of the peril that results from seeking anything but honoring the Most High the Most High good as a principle, always and in everything that one could possibly do in life and death. Death is a part of the cycle of life. Death is also part of war. God isn't just destroying unprovoked in the Old Testament. You see that it's written in Exodus, which is what we're going to go through. He notes Exodus 4:21 through 23, which we're going to get to. We're going to do chapters 3 and 4 of Exodus in just a moment. So we'll re-get to this after we get to this post, right? Then you shall say to the Pharaoh, this is what the Lord says, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I said to you, let my son go so that he may serve me. But you have refused to let him go. Behold, I am going to kill your son, your firstborn. So something that you'll notice about the Most High, which is, however you refer to God in this instance, is that he doesn't impose upon anyone's free will to force the right action, but he is clear that he will punish the wrong with an equal or greater force. God doesn't need worship to fuel his being. It's necessary to have a relationship with him. God deserves gratitude for our life and glory for his creation, much like how our parents on earth essentially deserve respect and gratitude for our very physical being, even if you have a rough relationship with him. Life and love are a gift, and gifts can also certainly be taken from us. The will of God is evident in every synchronicity we will collectively ever experience. That sounds a lot like the stuff that I talk about. There is a master architect, and gratitude for the beauty of our conscious experience is necessary to strive towards his likeness. The New Testament is the completion of the life and death cycle and the roadmap to transcending the suffering that comes as a result of our wrongdoing onto others as sin. We must sacrifice our desires in order to transcend. We must also believe that we are beyond our guilt, shame, and fear, have been spiritually delivered by Christ, the incarnation of godliness, from our darkness in order to transcend our lower natures, or as some would say, like raise into higher chakras, depending on, kind of where your belief system is, right? Some people believe in in spirituality in different ways like that, even though it all, a lot of the time, ends up being fairly similar in nature. The Old Testament, he continues, is the story of the harsh reality of how we fall short of having faith in the spirit of what is good in all eternity. The same faith bears the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, ways of being associated with reciprocating goodwill with others. In both modern and historical society, We see in both the degenerate and sophisticated aspects of societies, debauchery manifests to the highest degree. People sacrifice human babies, enslave others to build monoliths, and even have orgies to pay homage to idols, figures that represent aspects of nature other than the Most High, which is, God, depending on what version of spirituality you're using here. The practices and praises given to those figures did not bear fruit, but that dollar bill in your pocket says, "In God we trust." Christendom has built the world. Falling from those values is destroying it. Let us not equate the illness, that is, inflicting suffering upon others, with corporate punishment and sacrifice in the name of Thee whom is holy. And he goes on a little bit. I'll skip some parts of it. Death and destruction is not evil. Rather, smiting evil is a necessary sacrifice in the name of justice. War was a necessary atonement for evil. It was necessary for us to understand humility beyond the sheer magnitude of the universe through being thwarted. And he goes on in a little bit more about like cycles of different things that results in different things, right? The blessing and curse of free will is being the cause of and receiving the effects of our own choices, good and bad, regardless of our circumstances. In the Bible, the peoples you see truly suffer on behalf of God is God's people. This is also a foreshadowing of what aspiring to a life led by the Spirit is like. The most mocked religion is Christianity. The goal of the enemy in any endeavor is to distort the truth, the Logos, the Christ, the Most High Good. Gratitude is essential vibrationally to overcome our lower natures, to dwell in our heart, then go even further beyond ourselves. And, this is where the enemy comes in and starts to say stuff like, oh, look at your God. He's killing things. God wouldn't kill things. That's a demon. Such is the nature of the people who aspire towards God to bite the fruit, then fall from receiving God's grace, which is so literally living a life of conscious gratitude. It can be hard to read about how the ancient Israelites would go through this vicious cycle. Like one, be in paradise, stray from God to justify their animalistic nature, suffer for it, still seek God again, and only then, in that case, would he require a sacrifice, right? So essentially the point of all this is that the Old Testament is a story of progression. It's the sequence of up and down. It's the ebb and flow and nature of the world. It's basically God saying, like, as I said, or as I read earlier from this article, be in paradise, stray from God to justify their animalistic, innate human nature, then suffer for it, and then still seek God again, right? It's only in those cases that he would require sacrifice. He requires you to sacrifice something, and it's not necessarily something that is like physical in nature. It could be something metaphorically too. All it kind of tends to imply here, which is what the Old Testament ends up doing, just maybe sometimes via metaphor, is you still do have to sacrifice something, right? The dance of good and evil, this is continuing in the article, really. The dance of good and evil is really the story of the toiling that goes on within us all, physically, mentally, and spiritually, as we go through our conscious experience. Since day one, spirituality has been a matter of how the things we value relate to our beliefs and how our rituals develop our collective being, and the struggle for justice in a world where evil is allowed in order for the alchemical purification of our soul. It kind of reminds me of like the idea of just yin and yang, right? That light can't exist without dark, and vice versa. And that's not to say that, the Old Testament is the dark part of that. The Old Testament is dark and the New Testament is light. But it kind of goes to show the innate human nature of all of us. And it makes it seem not entirely unreasonable that, God does some of the stuff that he does in the Old Testament. So is Old Testament God evil? I don't think so. I think it's just, it's tough love. And a lot of the sacrifices that he talks about, again, as I said earlier, this wasn't in the article. This was just some thoughts that I had, right? When he says sacrifice, when sacrifice ends up being like the most important value that you think about, when you think about having a problem with Old Testament God, right? When he goes, but he wants us to sacrifice stuff. It's like, well, he wants us to sacrifice. I don't necessarily know if he wanted us to sacrifice like people or animals or what have you, but when sacrificing things, that kind of implies that our place here in the realm of his current kingdom is the most important thing. And it's really not. Like, if our spiritual beings are ultimately, meant to ascend to a higher plane and escape that cycle of samsara that some sects of spirituality believe are innately within all of us, then, even metaphorically or physically, sacrifice is kind of necessary, right? And so this brings us to Exodus, because that's what we're going to go through in today's Bible study. We're going to start off with Exodus chapter 3, right? I know that the thing that caused me to go to Exodus, by the way, was that passage from Exodus 4, like 19 through 21, I think, in that Twitter post. It was long enough to be an article, so it could basically just be an article, right? So we're going to go through some of that and go through, the very classic Old Testament story of Moses. We're going to skip the first couple chapters where it's like Moses was born and this is who Moses is and all that stuff. That's basically what the first couple chapters are. So starting at chapter 3, right? Chapter 3 is where Moses at the burning bush comes into play. Now, Moses was tending the flock of Jethro to his father, or Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the burning bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. So when the Lord saw that, he turned aside to look. God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. So I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land, to a good and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to a place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed them. So this is the start of it, right? This is, you've heard the classic. There have been so many jokes made about it in pop culture about how, look, Moses is at the burning bush, and this is him directly communicating with God, right? And, for some people that might not have necessarily read it directly, this is exactly how it is. This is, I like how God basically told Moses, like, look, take off your sandals. This is holy ground that you're walking on here. This is important. Pay attention. Listen up. I also like how, I don't know if I like it necessarily, but Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God, right? And it's important because that might not necessarily be something that we would do today, right? I'm not necessarily sure if that was something that was out of fear, or if it was something that was out of respect, or maybe it was a little bit of both, honestly, because I will admit that, if I was in that situation, it would be hard not to look, right? It would be hard not to be like, to not satisfy your little curiosity like that. Like, hey, I wonder what God does look like. And then, of course, then God's talking about how, okay, look, I've heard the cry of your people who are being basically slave driven by the Egyptians. And so God said, all right, I'm deciding, I got you guys. I'm going to take you out of there, and I'm going to set you off on a new path. I'm going to give you new land, fresh with milk and honey, and you will be my chosen people, basically, is what God's saying to Moses. And then Moses continues, or God continues, come now, therefore, and I will send you to the Pharaoh so that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to the Pharaoh and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? So he said, I will certainly be with you, and this shall be a sign to you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Then Moses said to God, indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Moreover, God said to Moses, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, the Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial to all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together, and say to them, the Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and of Jacob, appeared to me, saying, I have surely visited you, and seen what is done to you in Egypt. And I have said, I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, to a land flowing with milk and honey. Then they will heed your voice, and you shall come, you and the elders of Israel, to the king of Egypt, and you shall say to him, the Lord God of the Hebrews has met with us, and now please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I am sure that the king of Egypt will not let you go, no, not even by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand, and strike Egypt with all my wonders, which I will do in its midst. And after that he will let you go, and I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And it shall be, when you go, that you shall not go empty-handed, but every woman shall ask of her neighbor, namely of her who dwells near her house, articles of silver, articles of gold, and clothing, and you shall put them on your sons and daughters. So you shall plunder the Egyptians. So this is basically, like, of course, you know, God tells Moses, right? And Moses kind of has the natural questions that people are going to have if they hear from God. Like, all right, look, I'm going to free all of your people from slavedom. I'm going to take you to a new land, and I'm going to set you all free, and you're going to be my chosen people. So naturally, of course, Moses has those questions. It's like, so wait, what should I tell the people when they ask me, like, so like, how are we going to do this? How are we going to go? What am I even going to tell them? Like, should I tell them that God told me to do this? Is that really what I should tell them? And of course, you know, because he's God responds to him and goes like, yeah, just tell him I am who I am. You know, I don't need to justify myself to you. I don't need to justify that. You know, I am who I am. That's just how it is. And he gives Moses like clear and specific instructions on what to do. You know, it's, but every woman shall ask of her neighbor, namely of her who dwells near her house, articles of silver, articles of gold and clothing, and you shall put them on your sons and on your daughters, so you shall plunder the Egyptians. And, oh, of course, you know, I like when Moses asks too, like, or God tells Moses, like, of course the Egyptian's not going to let you go, but don't worry, I'm going to strike him down. Just you wait, you know. Go tell him that, like, we're going to need to go in 3 days, okay? We're going to need to go for 3 days, but he's not going to let you. You really think he's going to let you do that? No? All right, well, Don't worry. Don't worry. Just I'll take care of it. I'll strike him down. I'll strike him down. Don't you worry about that. I kind of like it, and this is why, that Twitter post ended up bringing me to this part of the Old Testament, right? Because it starts off, this is one of those things that cause people to have problems with like Old Testament God, right? It's like Old Testament God sounds vain, but no, it's just in a way. Like, it is one of those things that implies like, okay, look, you're thinking about your worldly relation to what is going on with you in your situation with you and the Egyptians, right? Meanwhile, God is thinking on such like a heavenly scale. God is that guy that's like playing 4D chess with everything, right? And that kind of between this and that Twitter post that I was reading earlier, it's like, yeah, sure, it may sound kind of crude, and it may sound like that, you have a problem with it, or it may sound like something that, something that's not a just God would do. But you really read it and you really look into it. It's like, look, there's a clear reason for it. There's a clear reason for that. There's a clear reason for everything, right? It's, as I said earlier, it's the ebb and flow. It's the ebb and flow. It's the Ouroboros of humanity. It's, okay, Moses, you and your people have suffered. Your people have suffered in my name, but because you suffered in my name, now I see you. I'm going to give you land, and you are now going to be my people, right? So moving on to chapter 4, right? This is where I believe this is where Moses starts to go to the Pharaoh, right? Then Moses answered and said, but suppose they will not believe me or listen to my voice. Suppose they say, the Lord has not appeared to you. So the Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? Moses said, a rod. And he said, cast it on the ground. So he cast it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses fled from it. So, look, I feel like Moses was on board, right? Despite the fact that Moses had the most reasonable questions that any of us would ask. Like, look, you're talking to a burning bush, and that burning bush is talking to you, and that burning bush is God, right? Of course, you sitting there, even Moses, right? You're sitting there probably going to ask some questions. So, like, what am I going to tell people? Am I really going to tell people that's God? And so God is like, so finally when Moses confronts him and asks him, all right, so what am I going to do? Like, suppose people don't believe me. So what do I do now? And then God's like, all right, so throw that stick you have on the ground. And then God just, boom, turns it into a snake. And the snake just, you're not going to not believe after that. You're not going to look at God instantly turning a stick into a snake and go, I don't know. I don't know about that. Then the Lord said, so starting at verse 4 in chapter 4, then the Lord said to Moses, reach out your hand and take it by the tail. And he reached out his hand and caught it, and it became a rod in his hand, that they may believe that the Lord God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. Furthermore, the Lord said to him, now put your hand in your bosom. And he put his hand in his bosom, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous like snow. And he said, put your hand there again. So he put his hand in his bosom again, and drew it out of his bosom, and behold, it was restored like his other flesh. Then it will be, if they do not believe you, nor heed the message of the first sign, that they may believe the message of the latter sign. And it shall be, if they do not believe even these two signs, or listen to your voice, that you shall take water from the river, and pour it on the dry land. The water which you take from the river will become blood on the dry land. Then Moses said to the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither before nor since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. So the Lord said to him, who has made man's mouth? Or who makes the mute, the deaf, the seeing, or the blind? Have not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth, and teach you what you shall say. But he said, O my Lord, please send by the hand of whomever else you may send. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, is not Aaron the Levite your brother? I know that he can speak well. And look, he is also coming out to meet you. When he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. Now you shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and I will teach you what you shall do. So he shall be your spokesman to the people, and he himself shall be as a mouth for you, and you shall be to him as a God, and you shall take this rod in your hand with which you shall do the signs. I think this is interesting, right? Because it seems like, you know how, and this will happen a lot in life, right? Where you'll be talking to somebody, right? Maybe with the intention of trying to get advice from that person. And how many times has this happened before in life where you'll be talking to somebody, trying to get advice from them, and as you're getting advice from that person, it's stuff that you know that you should do, right? Like Moses knows that this is what he's got to do now. He just saw God take his hand, put it on his butt, and turn it into a leprosy hand, and then instantly change it back. He also just saw God turn a stick into a snake, right? So Moses knows, he's got to know by now that this is the real deal. So how many times are you talking to somebody, trying to get advice from them, but as you're getting advice from that person, you have every last excuse in the book. Like, you're getting told, all right, well, you should do this. You should maybe think this way. And meanwhile, you're giving off all the excuses like, oh, but, I just have this excuse and I have this excuse and I can't do this because of this and I can't do this because of this. That's what Moses is doing here to God. And God's just like, look, and you could hear it earlier. I forget exactly which verse it is. Verse 14. So the anger of the Lord was kindled with Moses, right? Like God's starting to get upset. He's getting upset here because Moses is being one of those guys. He's being one of those like reply guys on social media that's just kind of coming out and going, but I can't do that. I can't do that. I'm not a good speaker. And God's just kind of giving an answer to every last excuse that Moses has. And that has to be, that there's got to be a lesson there, right? There's got to be a lesson there to stop giving excuses. When you get a message from God, right? God is giving you a message for a reason. He's giving you the message to go do it, and he's going to take care of whatever excuses that you may have. And should you question it, that seems to be where some of his ire comes from. And it seems like it's rightfully so. Like, look, don't get me wrong. Like, none of us are even close to being as perfect as God. But how many times have you tried to give advice to somebody and that person that you're giving advice to, like, starts to give all the excuses? Like, well, I can't do this because of this. I can't do this because of this. And they give every last excuse in the book. Like, it makes you a little bit angry, right? So, of course, it's going to make God angry, right? And this goes back to the entire idea of the segment that, like, this is one of the reasons that people get upset at Old Testament God is because, like, it seems like Old Testament God is angry. It's like, would you not be angry? Would you not also be angry in this situation? Like, if you were God here, would you not be angry at Moses? Because Moses is being a whiny little, word that I'm not going to say in the Bible study segment because it's the Bible study segment, right? Would you not be angry at Moses if you were God here? Because Moses is just kind of sitting there whining, going like, but I can't, but you can, and I'm going to take care of it for you. And if that's not a lesson to like the rest of us in life, then, it kind of clear as day here. So starting at verse 18, right? So Moses went and returned to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, please let me go and return to my brethren who are in Egypt and see whether they are still alive. And Jethro said to Moses, go in peace. Now the Lord said to Moses in Midian, go return to Egypt, for all the men who sought your life are dead. Then Moses took his wife and his sons and set them on a donkey, and he returned to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the rod of God in his hand, and the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do all those wonders before the Pharaoh which I have put in your hand. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then you shall say to the Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. But if you refuse to let him go, indeed I will kill your son, your firstborn. And it came to pass, on the way at the encampment, that the Lord met him and sought to kill him. Then Zipporah took a sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son and cast it at Moses' feet and said, surely "You are a husband of blood to me." So he let him go. Then she said, "You are a husband of blood because of the circumcision." And the Lord said to Aaron, "Go into the wilderness to meet Moses." So he went and met him on the mountain of God and kissed him. So Moses told Aaron all the words of the Lord who had sent him and all the signs which he had commanded him. Then Moses and Aaron went and gathered together all the elders of the children of Israel, and Aaron spoke all the words which the Lord had spoken to Moses. Then he did the signs in the sight of the people. So the people believed, and when they heard the Lord had visited the children of Israel, and that he looked on their affliction, then they bowed their heads and worshipped. So that's the rest of that's the rest of chapter 4. And it's God doing exactly what he was going to say, right? And remember when Moses said earlier in the first couple verses of chapter 3, where Moses is like, yeah, but the Pharaoh's not going to let us go. But then God said, look, don't worry, I'll take care of that. And he did. And he did exactly what he was going to do. And again, this the common theme of tonight's Bible study segment is to answer that question about Old Testament God. And of course, you have to go through it yourself to see whether or not God was justified in doing any of this stuff. And what I want to know from you guys is, like, as you hear this, is like, and we're going to continue to go through more of this stuff, is what do you think about whether or not God was justified in doing any of this stuff? Like, of course he was. Like, remember when he said to the Pharaoh, "Thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn," or "Israel is my son, my firstborn," like the people of Israel. "So I say to you, let my son go so that he may serve me. But if you refuse to let him go, indeed, I will kill your son, your firstborn." And this goes back to that Twitter post that we were talking about earlier, the one that caused me to kind of like look at this passage in the first place, right? He's not destroying unprovoked in the Old Testament. Something you'll notice is that he doesn't impose upon anyone's free will to force the right action, but it is clear that he will punish the wrong action with an equal or greater force. Like, he's still giving you the choice in that situation. He's still giving the Pharaoh the choice in that situation. Like, look, I am allowing you to choose to do the right thing, and if not, you will be punished. Like, that doesn't completely sound unreasonable to me, right? You know, that even now, you know, if we do bad things, we get punished for it. Like, that's just kind of the ebb and flow. That's the Ouroboros of nature. That's the ebb and flow of, like, good and evil. That's just how things work, man. So that's chapter 3 and 4 of Exodus. We're going to continue to, I don't know if we'll continue to go through Exodus next time, but we'll definitely find some Old Testament passages, ones that people tend to have problems with, so that we can go through it ourselves, right? And see whether or not, you know, the common adage that people have. Remember, as I said earlier, a lot of the common things that stop people from being believers is that idea that, like, Old Testament God is evil and wrathful, and that's just not something that I can believe in. But, you know, when you go through it yourself, you kind of see that it's a little bit justified, and it goes through some of the rules of, or it abides by a lot of the human nature rules of our world, right? So this is one of those situations that, you know, you just let me know what you think about this, because we're going to continue to go through some more Old Testament stuff, particularly like some controversial and spicy Old Testament stuff. That way we can see, you know, because one of the things that I said at the beginning of my journey down God's path is that, like, look, I can't honestly say that I have a problem with any of this stuff until I've gone through it myself. So we're going to go through all of it together, right? And for the time being, this was the one that came up this week as I was reading a nice justification that put into words that, like, actually, no, Old Testament God's fine. You know, you just have to look at it a certain way, right? And so with that new context in mind, like, what do you think about this? What do you think about, especially if you've read some of the other, you know, spicy parts of Old Testament, right? I would be curious as to what you think, or what some of your personal struggles have been with it. Because again, I've talked before about how, I've had some chats with my family about how they'll go through the Old Testament sometimes and they'll have to close it and go, man, I don't know about that God. I don't know. I'm sure you must have had a reason for it, but that was probably just incomprehensible to me, but I don't know about that. But so far, right? So far, to me, it seems fairly justified, right? God gave everybody the option to do what he wants them to do, and they were only punished when they strayed from it, right? And, I get that as we get further into New Testament, the idea of redemption comes further into play, which is why I do think that, a lot of the lessons in New Testament are particularly important too. But I don't know. It's tough to say for now until we continue to go more through it. But I'm curious what you think about it. So let me know if you have any other particularly spicy Old Testament passages that you have problems with. Then leave a comment about that, and maybe that'll be something that we go through next time. And we can do that. We can do some of that stuff together. So that was the first foray, I think, into the Old Testament for us in Lighthouse Jock Bible studies. So next time, of course, actually, I guess I should do the influencer bit first. All right. Let me put on the influencer cap. Prep for it. Don't forget to follow, like, and subscribe, and leave a comment. Ugh, gross. I hate it. I hate doing that. I'm not going to do that. But, yeah, let me know what you think about any of this stuff. So, next week, of course, we will return once again live at midnight Eastern on Friday. I will open the phone lines next week, too. Because I know we didn't necessarily get to it this week because I still had some work to do with it. But look, next week we're gonna open the phone lines. Okay, we're just gonna crack it right open, get the live show truly started. Definitely have some fun stuff for next week planned. I don't, and we'll think about that over the next week. But it'll happen. It'll happen. Trust me. So, as always, do not forget to subscribe if you are listening to the main show and you want to subscribe to the Bible study channel. Then the Bible study channel is at Lighthouse Jock Bible Study on YouTube. And if you are listening to the Lighthouse Jock Bible Study channel and want to subscribe to the main show too, then it's just Lighthouse Jock, right? It's, again, the Bible study does not get cut out of the main show. It just gets kind of clipped and put on the Bible study channel just in case you only want to follow along the Bible journey that we are all going on together and with God, together and with him. That one should be the most important, but we're all together in this. We're all in this together. Right? Anyway, so that'll do it for tonight. Love you all. We'll see you next week. Again, if you want the uncensored version without all the F words, podcast will be out tomorrow. If you can handle the F words, the live show VOD will remain on the channel. But until next week, bye.
Do I look like I know what a JPEG is? I just want a picture of a goddamn hot dog.